Okay, sounds good. So we're recording now. Welcome everyone to the UOS practice for refutation and efficiency. Today we're going to be focusing on different strategies that we would use to engage in clash, to engage in comparatives, to refute other teams' arguments. So that's what this round is going to be focusing on. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll get to them as soon as possible. So refutation and efficiency. The first concept that is extremely important to remember, or first concept that's extremely important to kind of keep in the back of your mind whenever you're doing refutation, is the idea of the axis of argumentation. So what do the axes of argumentation mean? I'm sure a lot of you math kids probably already know. Basically, axis exists on a scale of how true an argument can be and how important an argument can be. And that's how you want to think about, or the framework upon which you want to consider all arguments that are kind of presented to you, how true it is versus how important it is. So the most optimal argument that you would like to make is basically an argument that is both very true and both very important. Obviously, it's very difficult to get to this stage just because, varying upon debate, certain arguments can be more or less important, more or less impactful. So this is just based on how well you're able to frame those arguments within the round. But that's less so important. This concept is more so just to have you guys remember that when you're refuting arguments, there's two ways in which you can refute things: upon the axis upon how true it is and the axis upon how important it is. So for some examples, right? These are just kind of meme examples. Don't worry too much about those. But I want to use this to highlight some points, right? So obviously, an example of an argument that is both untrue and both unimportant. I wrote theory of evolution, but you can probably think about a bunch of different arguments that you probably heard at tournaments that you've went through, at arguments you might have heard during practice that haven't been really proven to take place in the first place, but also haven't been really proven why they're significant or important within the round to actually consider either. So that's an example of very weak argument that isn't really weighed heavily within the round. Usually this kind of argument kind of just falls out of the round, becomes relatively inconsequential in the evaluation the judge is going to make. So then, what's an example of an argument that is both true, that is extremely true, but not necessarily important? And this is an example of an argument that Ethan Curry always talks to us about. And basically, there was a motion. I don't remember the exact wording, but basically, it was to the effect of whether or not it's legitimate. Whether or not it's legitimate for protesters to engage in the vandalization of public property, to enact certain kinds of social changes that social justice movements want. And basically, an argument that someone made an opposition was that, well, we shouldn't allow protesters to vandalize, or social justice movements shouldn't try to do this or cause property damage because this will necessarily hurt trees, because vandalizers will spray paint trees, that'll hurt their bark, and the trees will die. So basically, this is an example of an argument that probably is true, right? It's probably true. It's probably true that when you have large scale protests. I wanted to save Ethan some face, but this is an argument that is probably true. Because feasibly, if you have large scale protests, you're probably going to get some property damage of trees and stuff like that. But when the debate is about specifically how it is that social justice movements are better able to kind of enact social change, and to enfranchise their own interests and stuff like that in the broader, in a broader and oppressive system, the consequences that pertain to trees during protests are not that important when evaluating whether or not this debate, who wins this debate. So this is an example of an argument that is true, but not very important within the round. So it falls out on that grounds as well. And this is another argument. This will stop nuclear war. And basically, this is a running meme or running joke that we have, but it's pretty true. And basically, this is a meta in wait, hold on. This is going to go in public. I'm not going to say the region, but in a specific region of people with funny accents. This argument is commonly run as a mechanism in a bunch of different international relations rounds, where they'll just say, yes, this policy is going to stop nuclear war. Or if we engage in this policy, the world is going to end because countries are going to engage in nuclear war and stuff like that, and everyone's going to die. So this is an argument that is very important, right? If it's true that some policy is going to stop nuclear war, if it's true that some policy will lead to nuclear war, that's probably an argument that you want to weigh very heavily within the round, right? However, If you're not able to prove this to be the case, to prove that this is actually going to happen, then this argument also becomes inconsequential when evaluating the debate because you have done nothing to prove why this is going to happen. And the reason why, it's oftentimes more difficult in this instance to use these kinds of like really high impact, very important arguments is because the higher the impact an argument has, the more legwork you have to do to prove why that thing is going to be true. Because, the ability to prove trees are going to get hurt, which is a very marginal impact, is very simple to do. Whereas proving something is going to lead to nuclear war takes a lot of analysis to kind of prove why something is going to happen, at least in the scale that nuclear war kind of exists in. So this is an example of an argument that is very important, but if you're not able to prove why this is going to happen or why this is untrue, this also becomes relatively irrelevant in the round. Finally, this is like a meme argument. Don't take this too seriously, but basically, this is the pinnacle of argumentation. An argument that is both true and important, where you take a very heavy impact. For example, some group of people is going to be harmed massively by X policy. And you're able to then prove necessarily why that impact necessarily comes from the premises of your argument. That is an example of a very strong argument that is weighed very heavily in the round because you're both able to prove why it is extremely relevant and you're also able to prove why it's necessarily going to happen. So this is an example of a very, very strong argument. And usually arguments are going to exist somewhere in the middle of this. So either, if you have an argument that is really true or not very important, it'll be here, some will be here. It really, really depends on the debate. But just keep in mind that you don't have to worry about getting all the way up to here. You just want to have an argument that optimizes to the best of your abilities, the ability to be proven to be true and also be proven to be important. Okay, so I kind of went through this already, but I guess I'll just reiterate it again. So as a result, given that the arguments that we kind of exist in debating exist on these two axes, these are the two avenues by which you can kind of refute these claims. The first is to prove an argument is untrue, and the second is to prove that it is unimportant. So for example, let's say a motion is this house will take guns away from police officers, right? And a claim one might make in this debate would be, well, we should take guns away from police officers because this will stop police brutality. This is usually the part where I ask you guys why this is not true, but it's a seminar, so I guess I can't do that. So I guess I'll just answer this question for you guys. The reason why this is not true, obviously, is because police brutality takes place in many, many forms. I think shootings, even though are a very important aspect of or realm in which police brutality exists, police brutality has a wide spectrum of how it manifests in the ways that it in ways that police can beat people up, in ways that police can engage in various degrees of physical assault on people that don't necessarily result in the death of someone via shooting someone, right? So the idea that, taking guns away from police officers is going to stop police brutality is unclear why this is necessarily true when there's so many other ways that police brutality kind of manifests in the world. So that's an example of disproving an argument by proving that it is untrue. You're not really disputing that, guns can kill people and police officers oftentimes use them in very pernicious ways, but you're just basically saying that, well, the whole idea that this is going to end police brutality as a whole is not going to happen. And that's an example of proving that an argument is untrue. The next is proving that it is unimportant. So this usually happens when a team is able to prove something to be true, but you want to still frame it out of the round because you don't think the judge should, weigh this heavily within the round. So for example, let's say a motion is this house will tax the rich very, very high. This is not a motion that's actually it's probably going to be worded like this, but something to the effect of this, like the death tax or whatever could be a good example of this kind of motion. But let's say the motion is this house will tax the rich very, very high. And someone says this is unfair because there's an asymmetry in the tax rates of different populations, i.e. they say, well, this is principally unfair because, the fact that you're taxing, rich people much higher than poor people is an example of an inequality that kind of exists in how you kind of tax different population or demographic groups. So this is probably true. It probably is technically unfair that, certain groups get taxed more than others on the basis of how much income that they make. But you can probably frame this out by saying, well, even if this is true, this is still unimportant. And you can give reasons for that, right? You can say stuff like, well, it's unimportant because you get massive, massive benefits from being able to tax rich people very, very high because you can fund various social programs that, that boost like the health of your economy. You can talk about how this like helps a lot of low income communities and stuff like that. There's a lot of different ways you can frame it, but at the end of the day, this is just an example of an argument that you can make to prove why an argument is unimportant, even if it is true. So these are two good examples to kind of highlight what I mean about engaging on the two axes of true versus importance. So some things of how not to do rebuttal. And I want to go over this really quick just because I think these are some habits that a lot of debaters have, especially when they start out. And even like when they're like more experienced as well, that I find in tournaments, that you should never do. So first is just only saying the other side didn't prove their claims. This does nothing to disprove a claim, right? At most, it just shows that the claim hasn't yet found a very eloquent advocate for it. But you need to explain why it is that that claim was not proven. So it's more time efficient to just lob right into disproving that claim than just making flippant examples for why that claim was not presented adequately. So this should certainly involve responding to the reasons the other side provided to believe their claim, but it shouldn't consist only of that. So you want to make sure you go into depth about and taking like the other team at their very best. Don't strawman them and refute their claims like as they kind of put them out. The second thing is saying that something is intuitively implausible to you. For example, oftentimes I see debaters make very flippant remarks like, well, come on, panel, that's just not how real people would work. Or if you're debating an international relations motion, you could say, well, the ICC or China or the United States would never do that. Well, if you know something to be untrue, then you probably know the reasons why it's untrue as well. So make sure you say it. Don't just end your analysis at that's not how people work or that's not how society works. I know this seems very intuitively obvious, but when you actually do debating, it's very, very clear how often people kind of do this kind of strategy when it comes to refuting arguments. So make sure you don't do that. And if people do that to you, make sure you call them out on it as well. So don't do this in terms of like if you want to engage in rebuttal. The third is saying that the other side have overstated their claim. This is like a little bit different. I can go over like more specifics about how to make this correct. So I'm not going to focus on this one too much. I'll talk about this in the next slide. The fourth is saying that an argument could be principally or largely used to justify other policies. So for example, if you're talking about, I can't think of a motion off the top of my head, but if it was a motion about banning something from society or whatever, because it's bad, you don't want to make an argument by saying, well, by this logic, they would want to ban this then. Or, oh, no, I remember an argument now. So let's say it was a motion about this house regrets the prominence of virtual reality in like popular media or something like that. And basically, there was a team that was basically saying, well, we want to ban this because it's a form of escapism. It's a form of like, it alienates you from like your social circles and stuff like that. And basically the other side was like, well, by this logic, are you just saying you want to ban people from watching movies then? And the other team was just like, yeah, sure, we'd be down to do that. So don't do principled arguments unless you're very experienced, right? You want to make sure that you don't use this kind of analysis because oftentimes teams will just bite the burden and just say, yeah, sure, I guess we'll be fine with like, banning those things as well. So don't use this argument of justifying or don't use this argument of saying that some argument could be principally or logically used to justify other policies unless the policy that you're talking about is very, very heinous. That's the only time in which it could work. The fifth thing is just giving a counterexample. And this happens the most, I think, in international relations debate, where someone can say X policy works because China did this once and it worked. And then another person will say, well, this policy actually doesn't work because France did this and it didn't work for them. The most important thing to do is provide the best reasons to believe or disbelieve a statement. Examples don't mean anything by themselves because there could be a million reasons for why the example exists. There could be a million reasons for why the policy worked in one country and didn't work in another. You have to explain why it is appropriate in this specific situation. So you still need to go through the analysis of explaining structurally why their arguments might not work properly. And then you can use examples to kind of add characterization to add more grounding to your argument. But just giving a counterexample should never be your main approach to doing refutation. Okay, so how to do rebuttal well. The first is pointing out that 2 points are mutually incompatible. So this is it's oftentimes fruitless and confusing to disprove two conflicting claims at once. So I know a lot of people have a very bad habit of doing just full on line by line refutation. Every single thing that the other person says, you try to refute and stuff like that. But if you're able to identify certain claims that exist that are mutually incompatible with one another, or you're able to identify claims as kind of like we went through in last week's seminar with Vidit's seminar about underlying assumptions, in which you can disprove a whole host of claims through one underlying assumption that kind of exists throughout all those arguments, that is significantly easier as a point of refutation than just going line by line and refuting every single thing that they made. Because oftentimes you waste a lot of your time. You're not able to make your own arguments properly. And also you don't really get to the root of why their side is bad. You're only disproving very specific pieces of their arguments as well. So don't do this as a form of refutation. The second is saying that a point is marginal compared to your side. So basically, a very common phrase that you'll hear us use is even taking opposition or taking government at their best and assuming they've proven X policy or X thing to happen is a very useful sentence here, right? Because you just have to say why an argument is comparatively unimportant. You don't have to go through the hassle of disproving it, right? So this is the idea. And I used this seminar before. I'll go over what this video is like maybe later if you guys are interested in it later. But basically, this is the idea of refuting an argument on the basis of it being unimportant by saying, even if they've proven X thing to be true, even if they've proven, like these impacts to flow from their premises, here's why this argument still is not important within the round or why you shouldn't evaluate it. This is also very, very strong. So you don't have to go through the hassle of disproving an argument, especially in many cases, the argument might have been proven pretty well. The third is saying that some different outcome actually flows from their premises. So this is distinct from just saying that their conclusion doesn't follow, right? Because now you're providing an active reason to support your side instead of a reason to think theirs haven't done all the work that they needed to do. Because for example, if you refute someone by saying, well, actually their conclusion doesn't follow from their premises, that doesn't necessarily mean their argument is weak, right? That just means that they personally haven't been able to properly mechanize or analyze a certain aspect of the argument properly for the judge. Even though that's still significant within a round, that doesn't do anything to explain why your side is preferable for this or why their argument, even if it's proven properly, should fall out of the round. So here you have the chance to say, well, even if they're able to prove some certain outcomes to exist or like some certain mechanisms that are inherent to their case, here's why different outcomes actually flow from this. So for example, right, if you're talking about a death tax about or raising taxes or something like that, I guess like the death tax. The death tax is basically a tax where after you die, a lot of your money is kind of like taxed by the state. So you have less to inherit to like your next generation. And this primarily focuses on people who are ultra rich, but it does affect people who are middle class, lower middle class, stuff like that as well. In which case, then you can maybe argue that from government that, well, this is good because you have more tax money to like fund social programs, whatever, right? In which case, on opposition, you could say, well, actually, even if on face value you're taxing rich people more, it actually is significantly worse for poor people because, I don't know, there's different avenues by which inheritance can be passed down. You can, put all your money into like property investment and stuff like that. You can pass it down that way that, poor people oftentimes don't have the ability to do so. So this means that, rich people can still get away from evading this tax. And now you're raising taxes on like poor people. So then you can say, well, actually a different outcome flows from their premises. You don't necessarily get income inequality. Rather, you get significantly more income inequality because you're raising taxes on like poor people while rich people can get away by evading those taxes. So that's an example of saying a different outcome actually flows from the premises. And like this is usually where you're able to co-opt a lot of the benefits or harms that like another team might be talking about. The fourth is providing mechanisms and incentive structures that show why something isn't true or won't happen. And this is better than just attacking the other side's own argumentation because it's making your rebuttal much more robust against further speeches, right? Because this is basically and this is where it kind of gets hard to distinguish between like refutation and constructive, but you're basically just explaining, here are the structural reasons for why certain policies or certain impacts might flow from certain premises. And this means that like in the future, if a team is trying to rebuild their case or try to refute you, it becomes significantly more difficult to kind of engage with your case because you've also provided so many more reasons to believe why your side is preferable in that instance as well. So these are examples of ways to do rebuttal well. And you guys can take a look at the slide afterwards to refresh your memory on different strategies that exist. Okay, let me see. These are not too important. I am meeting the 20-minute mark, so I don't want to go too in depth on this. So I think we can call this recording to an end here.